Today is July 3rd, 2026, and the quantitative picture of this conflict's trajectory that can now be assembled from the data points this session's coverage has been accumulating deserves a specific synthesis moment because several major new figures have become available that allow this analysis to state with greater precision what has previously been characterized in directional rather than quantitative terms: the drone effectiveness curve, the casualty ratio's historical dimension, the specific geography of Ukraine's strike range extension, the gasoline import mathematics, and the institutional behavior signals from Russia's banking and intelligence sectors each contribute a specific quantitative or qualitative addition to the analytical framework this session's coverage has built, and their convergence on a single directional conclusion is now sufficiently documented to be stated without analytical overreach. Let's start with the drone effectiveness curve, because this is the data point whose trajectory dimension is most analytically significant for assessing where this campaign is heading, rather than simply where it stands today. Russia has reported shooting down 63,933 Ukrainian drones in the first half of 2026. This is Russia's own figure. Generated by the same state communications apparatus, this analysis's companion coverage has documented as systematically distorting unfavorable data upward in the direction of Russian performance and downward in the direction of Russian problems. If Russia is reporting 63,933 drone intercepts, the actual number should be treated as the minimum bound on the first half's drone activity rather than as a precise count. What makes this figure analytically useful is not its precision, but its distribution. May and June together account for approximately 50% of the entire 6-month total, with June alone representing approximately 28% and May approximately 22%. The first 4 months of 2026 contributed the remaining 50%. This means the attack rate in May and June combined was running at approximately 3 times the rate of the January-April average, a 197% acceleration from early year levels that describes not a sustained static campaign, but an escalating one whose most recent months are operating at a fundamentally different scale than its opening months. Before examining the penetration rate, let's establish what the 63,933 intercept figure implies for the scale of drone operations that produced it. If 35% of Ukrainian drone strikes successfully reach their targets, then the number shot down, 63,933, represents approximately 65% of total attacks, implying a total first-half drone deployment of approximately 98,000 platforms. This is not a figure that can be generated by a workshop-scale production operation or a black market procurement network. It represents an industrial drone manufacturing capability whose output is being consumed in the first 6 months of 2026 at a pace that exceeds many previous estimates of Ukraine's sustainable production capacity. And that is consistent with the Firepoint production ambitions this analysis's companion coverage has documented. The stated target of 300 FP1 drones per day alone would produce 54,000 platforms in a 180-day period, and the broader Ukrainian drone industrial base includes multiple manufacturers, multiple platforms, and multiple production facilities distributed across the country specifically to resist targeting of the production infrastructure itself. The 35% penetration rate estimated by Jane's Defense applies to the most recent reporting period and represents the proportion of Ukrainian drone strikes that are successfully reaching their targets rather than being intercepted. This figure is analytically significant for 2 reasons. First, it is not the failure rate that Russian air defense would prefer. A 35% success rate against an attack volume running at the current accelerated pace means the defending system is absorbing a substantial successful strike count, even while intercepting the majority of incoming platforms. Second, the penetration rate does not need to be high for the cumulative strategic effect to be severe. A 35% success rate applied to the June volume, representing 28% of a half-year total of nearly 64,000 reported intercepts, implying a June attack volume in the range of 17,000 to 18,000, produces a monthly successful strike count, whose order of magnitude exceeds anything Russia's pre-war planning contemplated as a manageable sustained threat to its domestic infrastructure. Now let's get into the casualty figures, because the CSIS assessment that has emerged provides a historical contextualization of Russian losses that this analysis has not previously established with this level of comparative precision. The Center for Strategic and International Studies assesses Russia's total casualties at approximately 4 million, with approximately 450,000 killed. The killed figure represents 32% of total casualties. Killed as a share of all casualties combined. This proportion is analytically remarkable in the context of modern warfare's casualty ratios. Contemporary conflicts with modern medical evacuation capability, trauma surgery infrastructure, and battlefield medical treatment protocols typically produce death-to-casualty ratios substantially lower than 32%, as the proportion of wounded who survive with treatment has risen dramatically since the pre-antibiotic, pre-surgical stabilization era. A 32% killed rate in the context of a conflict where Russia nominally maintains medical infrastructure and medical evacuation capabilities suggests either that Russian battlefield medical care is operating substantially below the standard its nominal infrastructure implies, or that the combat conditions being imposed on Russian forces, the 35-minute frontline survival window this analysis's companion coverage documented, the relentless drone surveillance, the compressed distances in which any wounded soldier must be retrieved, are producing mortality outcomes that overwhelm whatever medical capacity exists for treating them. The 32% killed to casualty ratio also deserves comparison against what modern military medical systems typically produce. In the United States, military's recent high-intensity conflicts, the killed to wounded ratio has been approximately 1.7 or better, meaning roughly 12-14% of total casualties result in deaths, with the remainder surviving due to rapid medical evacuation, body armor, and trauma surgery infrastructure. NATO standard casualty planning assumes similar ratios. A 32% killed rate is more than double this baseline, suggesting either a combat environment so lethal that the normal distinction between killed and wounded is being collapsed by the speed of lethality events, or a medical evacuation and trauma treatment system so overwhelmed or degraded that injuries that would be survivable with timely treatment are instead producing deaths. The 35-minute frontline survival figure this analysis's companion coverage, established from independent sourcing, is consistent with either interpretation. In an environment where a soldier is killed within the first half hour of arrival at his position, the window available for medical evacuation is also compressed to near zero. The historical comparison dimension of the 450,000 killed figure establishes its magnitude more concretely than the raw number alone conveys. Russian deaths in Ukraine now exceed Soviet losses in Afghanistan by more than 28 times. They exceed Russia's combined losses in both Chechen wars by more than 18 times. They exceed all Soviet and Russian post-war deaths combined, across every conflict Russia has fought in since 1945, by more than 9 times. For every 100 Ukrainian casualties, Russia is losing approximately 800. These comparisons are not rhetorical flourishes. They are the specific historical calibration markers that tell us which category of event this casualty count belongs to. Because without calibration against comparable events, a number like 450,000 lacks the reference frame that gives it analytical meaning. When it is calibrated against these specific benchmarks, the conclusion is unambiguous. Russia is experiencing casualties at a scale that has no precedent in its post-World War II military history, in a conflict whose duration and intensity are still actively expanding rather than approaching resolution. Now, let's get into the geographic scope of Ukraine's strike campaign, because the specific distance figures available today establish a territorial vulnerability picture for Russia that this analysis's companion coverage has referenced directionally but not fully quantified. Ukrainian drones have documented strikes reaching the Ural Mountains at approximately 1,600 kilometers from Ukrainian territory, western Siberia, at approximately 2,000 kilometers, Tyumen, a major oil and gas production hub, at more than 2,000 kilometers, Khanty-Mansisk, the oil region capital, at approximately 2,250 kilometers, and Salykard, an Arctic gas gateway facility, at approximately 2,150 kilometers. This geographic spread means that approximately 70% of Russia's total population lives within effective drone strike range of the current Ukrainian capability. The strategic significance of this figure extends well beyond the specific infrastructure targets that have been struck or potentially struck at these distances. It means that the mental model of a safe rear, the geographic assumption that motivated Russia's original decision to fight this war while maintaining normal civilian economic activity at distance from the front, no longer corresponds to physical reality across the overwhelming majority of Russia's populated territory. The Salykard distance is particularly significant for a reason this analysis has not previously addressed. Salykard sits adjacent to the Yamal Peninsula, which is the geographic location of Russia's most strategically important natural gas reserves, and the origin of the pipeline infrastructure through which Russia has historically sustained its energy export revenue. A Ukrainian strike capability that can reach 2,150 kilometers from Ukrainian territory, already demonstrated against infrastructure at that range, is capable in principle of reaching not just the refining capacity whose degradation this analysis has documented, but the extraction infrastructure whose loss would be genuinely irreplaceable on any medium-term timeline. Russia's previous strategic assumption was that this infrastructure was simply out of range of any threat Ukraine could pose. That assumption has been falsified. The Lukoil Kstovo facility strike adds specific production capacity quantification to what had previously been an aggregate 9 of 10 refineries struck figure. Kstovo is Russia's fourth largest oil refinery and its second largest gasoline producer, with a capacity of approximately 320,000 barrels per day. Degrading or removing 320,000 barrels of daily refining capacity from Russia's gasoline production system is not a marginal disruption to a system that can absorb it through available alternative capacity. It is the removal of Russia's second-largest single source of the fuel product, whose shortage has produced the gas lines, the military logistics degradation, the Crimean fuel crisis, and the food supply chain disruptions this analysis has been tracking across this session's coverage. When Russia's second-largest gasoline-producing facility is struck, the fuel shortage visible in gas lines across every Russian region except one is not a distributional problem that can be addressed by rerouting existing supply. It is a production volume problem that cannot be solved by any domestic means that do not involve restoring destroyed refining capacity, which requires time and infrastructure investment that the continued strike campaign's tempo does not currently allow. Now let's get into the gasoline import mathematics, because the specific figures available for India, Kazakhstan, and Belarus illustrate the economic distortion that the refinery campaign has produced with a precision that the aggregate fuel shortage reporting cannot fully convey. Russia is currently planning to import approximately 4 million barrels of gasoline per month from India. The specific economics of this arrangement reveal a structural distortion that is worth examining in detail. Russia is discounting its crude oil export price to India, reportedly from a previous discount of approximately $4 per barrel to a current discount of approximately $7 per barrel, specifically to create an incentive for India to refine that crude and return the resulting gasoline products to Russia. The transaction economics this produces are approximately as follows. Russia sells crude to India at $7 below market price, India refines it at Indian refinery costs, and Russia then purchases the resulting gasoline at market price. Russia is effectively subsidizing Indian refinery profits with the discount in order to access Indian refining capacity that it cannot currently provide domestically. This is the economic definition of a system operating under severe domestic supply constraint, and willingness to pay a cost premium, in this case the discount plus the transaction costs, for access to capacity whose domestic equivalent has been removed by the strike campaign. Kazakhstan is sending approximately 425,000 barrels to Russia as what is being characterized in some framing as humanitarian assistance, the characterization of a petroleum product transfer to one of the world's largest historical oil exporters as humanitarian assistance being itself a signal about how comprehensively the refinery campaign narrative has penetrated even the diplomatic framing of regional energy relationships. Belarus has tripled its oil sales to Russia, with recent figures showing approximately 600,000 barrels, 3 times the month before figure. The combined picture, India at 4 million barrels monthly planned, Kazakhstan at 425,000, Belarus at 600,000, describes a country whose own refining sector has been sufficiently degraded by sustained targeting that it is now assembling an improvised international supply chain of secondary suppliers to partially compensate for domestic capacity it can no longer provide. The Vice Premier Novak episode captures the political dimension of this supply chain crisis with a specific clarity that abstract statistics cannot convey. At a public event, Novak was asked about the gasoline situation. His reported response was that he had been promised before attending the event that he would not be asked about the gasoline, that nobody would talk about it. A government official whose portfolio includes energy policy, refusing to discuss the specific energy policy failure that is generating record gas lines, driving improvised international import arrangements, and producing the food supply chain disruptions. This analysis, we'll examine next, is communicating something precise about the institutional calculus inside Russia's government. The fuel shortage has become a topic whose public acknowledgement creates more problems than it solves, because acknowledging it requires explaining how Russia's second largest gasoline producer is importing gasoline from India at a discount, and there is no explanation for that situation that is compatible with the official communications framework of a country that is winning its war. Now let's get into the food supply chain disruption, because this is the dimension of the fuel shortage's cascading consequences that has received the least analytical attention relative to its significance for Russian domestic stability. The fuel shortage is not simply limiting civilian transportation or causing inconvenience at gas stations. It is degrading Russia's domestic food supply chain in a specific and time-sensitive way. The industry most immediately affected is the distribution of dairy and perishable products. Milk-based products specifically are being identified as items that are now spoiling before they reach their destinations, because the transportation slowdowns produced by fuel scarcity are extending transit times beyond the perishability window of the product. This is the specific cascade from military targeting of refinery infrastructure to civilian food security that distinguishes the current campaign from a simple economic disruption. When an attack on a refinery produces fuel scarcity that produces transportation, delays that produce food that spoils before delivery, the causal chain from military action to civilian daily life has collapsed to a span of weeks rather than months or years. A specific example from the Irkutsk region illustrates the shipping disruption's scope. A transport company that typically moves approximately 600,000 passengers and 2 million metric tons of cargo annually has announced that prices will quadruple and delivery routes will be cut, characterizing the situation as no longer economically viable under current fuel cost conditions. Irkutsk is in Siberia, far from the front lines, far from the areas most directly associated with this conflict's immediate military consequences. The presence of fuel shortage-driven commercial transport disruption in Siberia, at quadrupled prices and reduced route coverage, is the geographic evidence that the fuel crisis is not a southern Russia or Moscow region phenomenon, but a truly national infrastructure failure whose effects are propagating through the entire domestic logistics network. The people paid to wait in gas lines industry that has emerged in the Moscow region, a service market where individuals are compensated to sit in fuel queues on behalf of clients who cannot spend that time themselves, is not an economic curiosity. It is a price signal mechanism for the scarcity. The market is pricing the queuing time because that time has a genuine opportunity cost in a context where fuel access is the binding constraint on business activity. When a secondary market for queue sitting develops, it tells us that the fuel shortage has persisted long enough and been distributed unevenly enough that geographic or temporal access advantages can be monetized. The same economic logic that produces black markets for any product whose official distribution is insufficient relative to demand. The Saki airfield strike in Crimea adds a specific dimension to the broader Crimea coverage this analysis's companion coverage has developed, because it targets a different category of Russian military asset from the fuel, logistics, and civilian evacuation pressures that prior coverage has examined. The aircraft that provide Russia's airborne strike and air superiority capability over the southern theater. Reports of Ukrainian strikes destroying hangars hosting Su-30 and Su-30SM aircraft at Saki represent attacks against the platform category, whose presence in Crimea would be necessary for Russia to contest the partial air superiority that Gherkin's prison cell analysis, documented in this analysis's companion coverage, has characterized Ukraine as having achieved. An airfield in Crimea that has lost hangar infrastructure, and the aircraft housed within it is one that cannot easily be reconstituted as an operational base for the kind of air defense and strike missions that would be necessary to contest Ukrainian air operations in the theater. Combined with the Black Sea Fleet's documented effective elimination and the air defense unit withdrawals, this analysis's companion coverage has tracked, the Saki hangar destruction rounds out a picture of Crimea, whose Russian military defense capability has been systematically degraded across every domain, maritime, aerial, and ground-based air defense, simultaneously. Now let's get into the Alpha Bank chief's public statement about bank failures, because this represents the most explicit available warning signal about Russia's banking sector health from within the banking sector itself. The chief of Alpha Bank, one of Russia's largest private banks, made public statements in this reporting period preparing the population for the possibility of bank failures among smaller institutions. His specific framing was that smaller banks, those outside the top 20, are banks nobody really needs, and that Russia can handle fewer banks. The function of this statement is not simply an assessment of market structure. It is a preemptive normalization of the concept of bank failure for a population whose savings in those institutions are at risk. When a senior banker prepares the public for the eventuality that their bank might fail by characterizing that bank's existence as unnecessary, the implicit message to depositors in those institutions is, move your money now, because the failure is coming, and the justification for not covering it has already been publicly prepared. This specific signal connects directly to the banking withdrawal data this analysis's companion coverage has established. The $7 billion withdrawn in June alone, the $24, $3 billion withdrawn between February and June, totaling $161 million per day, the 30-year record for cash extraction from the Russian banking system. These figures are not the product of irrational panic. They are the product of rational risk assessment by depositors who are reading signals like the Alpha Bank chief's statement and concluding that the probability of bank failure has risen to the level where the cost of keeping deposits in the banking system, the foregone liquidity and privacy of physical cash, is lower than the risk of bank failure eliminating those deposits entirely. Now let's get into the intelligence service prison's development, because this is the institutional indicator. This analysis has identified as one of the clearest available signals of regime response escalation in the face of the pressures this session's coverage has documented. Reports indicate that Russia's Federal Security Service, The FSB and related intelligence apparatus has established its own detention facilities, specifically separate from the regular prison system in which convicted criminals and political detainees are ordinarily held. The analytical significance of this is structural rather than anecdotal. Regime that establishes parallel detention facilities outside the regular justice system is one that has concluded that the information environment within the regular system, the interactions between political detainees and ordinary prisoners, the access of family members and lawyers, the visibility of the detention to independent monitoring, creates risks that the regime cannot manage within the normal judicial framework. Separating security service detainees from the broader prisoner population eliminates the cross-contamination of information that the regular prison system creates. A person detained for political speech cannot, in a system-controlled facility, communicate the actual conditions of their detention or the circumstances of their arrest to other prisoners who might then communicate it outward. This specific institutional adaptation is consistent with what this analysis's companion coverage has identified as a Stalinist regression in regime management tools, not because the current regime approaches Stalin's scale of political violence, but because it is reaching for the same category of institutional tools: parallel justice systems, information compartmentalization, preventive detention of potential dissidents before they can organize, that characterize Stalinist governance during periods of regime stress. The existence of these tools does not guarantee their effectiveness in the current information environment. Russia's domestic social media ecosystem, the Telegram channels, the citizen video documentation that defeated Putin's fuel crisis denial speech, all of these represent information distribution channels that did not exist during the Stalinist period, and that these institutional tools were not designed to manage. Their deployment, therefore, tells us something about the regime's threat perception. It is treating the information environment as sufficiently dangerous to require tools associated with the highest historical periods of regime stress, without telling us whether those tools will prove adequate to the specific information challenges they are being deployed to address. Now let's establish two final data points that this analysis has not yet addressed in this specific script, before drawing all threads together: the 82% war-end polling figure and the 3% investment decline, because these two numbers together describe the psychological and economic forward expectations environment in which all the other developments this analysis has documented are occurring. Polling indicating that approximately 82% of Russians want to see the war end is substantially above the protest potential figures. This analysis's companion coverage documented through the LVADA centers 20% protests are possible, and 14% protests with political demands are likely figures. Those figures measured willingness to take action. The 82% figure measures expressed preference for a specific outcome, ending the war. The gap between 82% wanting the war to end and 20% being willing to actively protest for that outcome is not a contradiction. It is the specific operational characteristic of an authoritarian governance system. The preference and the willingness to act on it are separated by the cost the system imposes on acting. But it means that if that cost, the fear of consequences for expressing opposition, were ever to decline significantly, the expressed preference figure of 82% represents a latent constituency for war termination whose scale vastly exceeds any credible estimate of the genuine pro-war constituency, the 3% investment decline adds a forward-looking economic dimension to the current indicators. Investment is not a measure of current conditions. It is a measure of what economic actors expect the future conditions to be, and whether they believe investing in productive capacity now will be rewarded by returns in that future environment. A 3% investment decline occurring in the current environment means that the private sector has made a collective forward assessment. The conditions it expects for the period in which current investments would mature are not favorable enough to justify the current deployment of capital. Investment analysts surveying these figures are consistently returning negative expectations. No analyst surveyed appears to believe conditions are about to improve. The 3% investment figure and the unanimous negative expectations together describe an economy whose private sector has concluded, through the specific mechanism of refusing to invest, that the trajectory is getting worse rather than better. Now, let's bring all of these threads together, because the drone escalation curve, the historical casualty calibration, the geographic reach extension to 70% of Russia's population, the India-Kazakhstan-Belarus gasoline import mathematics, the Novak refusal, the Alpha Bank failure warning, the food supply chain disruption, and the intelligence service prisons all converge on a single analytical assessment that this session's coverage has been building toward. The convergence is not simply that multiple bad things are happening to Russia simultaneously. It is that these developments are not independent of each other. The drone escalation is the causal mechanism producing the refinery strikes. The refinery strikes are producing the fuel shortage. The fuel shortage is producing the logistics degradation. the food supply chain disruption, the Crimea isolation, and the military diesel shortage that is degrading frontline generators and air defense systems. The degraded air defense is enabling more successful drone penetration, which drives the escalating penetration rate. The economic pressure is producing the banking withdrawal, which is producing the Alpha Bank failure warning, which is producing further banking withdrawal. The casualty pace is producing the recruitment shortage, which is producing the $220,000 incentive that is still failing, which is producing the mobilization pressure that is driving the political dissent this analysis has documented across multiple scripts. The political dissent is producing the intelligence service prisons, which will produce further public anger, which feeds back into the polling numbers that are driving the election falsification planning. This is not a list of coincident problems. It is a description of a set of self-reinforcing feedback loops, each of which is contributing to the other's acceleration. And a governance system that this analysis's companion coverage has established lacks the interbranch coordination capacity to address complex, multidimensional challenges simultaneously. The drone curve's 197% acceleration means these loops are running faster at the end of the first half of 2026 than they were at the beginning. The penetration rate means they are becoming more efficient over time rather than less. And the historical casualty comparisons. 28 times Afghanistan, 18 times Chechnya, 9 times all post-war conflicts combined, establish that Russia has already crossed into territory without modern precedent, where no available Russian historical template provides guidance for how to navigate the path from the current position to a sustainable equilibrium. What this session's coverage has now established across its full complement of scripts, Iran, Russia, Ukraine, Crimea, economic, political, military, is not a prediction about a specific outcome, but a documented convergence of the specific indicators that historically characterize systems approaching inflection points. The resource depletion visible in the sovereign wealth fund and banking data, the institutional defection visible in the Duma speeches and elite capital flight, the information integrity failure visible in the main viewer and fuel crisis denial speech, the military capability degradation visible in the Tu-22 bomber count and the frontline survival figures, and the governance coordination failure visible in Stanovaya's diagnosis, and Novak's refusal to discuss the topic, whose management is notionally his primary institutional responsibility. Each indicator, examined individually, could in principle be managed within a functioning governance system. Their convergence, at the pace and scale this analysis's companion coverage has documented, is what warrants the specific conclusion this analysis will close with today. The falsifiability framework this analysis has applied consistently throughout this session's coverage requires stating what would constitute counter-evidence against the directional conclusion this script's synthesis is building toward. If Russia's refinery import arrangements, the India 3, 4 million barrel monthly pipeline, the Kazakhstan humanitarian transfers, the Belarus tripling, succeed in restoring domestic fuel supply to a level that allows its military and civilian logistics systems to operate at pre-crisis capacity, that would represent a meaningful challenge to the assessment that the refinery campaign is producing strategic rather than merely tactical effects. If the drone penetration rate of 35% begins declining as Russia deploys new electronic warfare and air defense adaptations faster than Ukraine can adapt its platforms and approach methodologies, that would suggest the escalation curve has encountered an effective countermeasure. If the polling figures showing 82% war and support translate into no measurable increase in protest activity or elite defection even after the VCIOM open poll suppression revealed the gap, that would suggest the governance system's deterrent capacity remains sufficient to prevent expressed preference from translating into political action. This analysis will continue tracking these specific indicators as the observable tests of the directional assessment it has developed. What it will not do is treat the current convergence of negative indicators as sufficient to conclude a specific outcome, because the specific moment of inflection in complex governance systems cannot be predicted from trajectory data alone. What the trajectory data can establish, and what this session's coverage has established across its full complement of scripts, is that the direction is clear, the pace is accelerating, and the governance architecture's adaptive capacity is increasingly insufficient to address the compound challenges the trajectory is producing. Russia is not losing this war in the sense that any individual battle outcome or any individual indicator has crossed a definitive military threshold. It is losing it in the sense that the compound trajectory this analysis has documented across all of these dimensions is moving in one direction, away from the conditions that would allow the war to continue indefinitely on its current terms, and that the governance architecture Russia has built is specifically ill-suited to the kind of multidimensional adaptive course correction that arresting this trajectory would require. The 82% polling figure, the 14, 3% investment decline, the Alpha Bank failure warning, the 450,000 killed, the 63,933 drones in 6 months, the 3. 4 million barrel monthly Indian gasoline pipeline, the Novak refusal, and the intelligence service prisons are not separate stories about separate problems. They are the same story, told through different measurement systems, about a governance architecture and a military force that is being consumed by a conflict it did not design to fight and cannot currently find a way to end.